The morning I received the position report from CB439, I assumed it was a satellite error. That's the rational assumption. That's what anyone in this field would think. A coastal warning buoy does not transmit from 47 miles inland. It does not appear on your telemetry screen sitting in the middle of a forest drainage basin at an elevation of 1,600 feet. And yet, there it was, identifier CB-439, reporting sea surface temperature, wave height, barometric pressure, and battery voltage from a position deep in the Caneta Valley, surrounded by old-growth timber that hasn't seen a road crew in 30 years. I need to explain what I do, because otherwise this won't make sense. My name is Rene Voss. For the past 9 years, I've worked as a field service contractor for the Pacific Coastal Observation Network, which is a semi-private consortium funded jointly by 3 county maritime authorities along the Central Coast. We maintain and service a string of 22 data buoys positioned between Tilford Head in the north and Gray's Inlet in the south, roughly 160 nautical miles of open water. These buoys measure wave height, wave period, sea surface temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, and current velocity. They relay data via satellite uplink on a timed cycle every 10 minutes during active storm conditions, every hour in calm weather. Each buoy has a unique identifier, a hull number stenciled in reflective marine paint, and an internal firmware designation that cannot be spoofed without physical access to the electronics housing. I know these buoys. I've been inside their data wells, replaced their solar charge controllers, cleaned biofouling off their sensor housings, swapped corroded shackles on their mooring chains. I can identify every single one by its telemetry signature. The data stream from CB439 was genuine. The encoding matched. The firmware handshake was correct. The satellite return confirmed a valid uplink. But the position was impossible. CB439 was anchored at station position 46.2831 north, 124.7714 west. That's 11 nautical miles offshore, in about 90 meters of water on a sandy bottom. It's a standard CB950 platform, yellow hull, 3 solar panels on a stainless tower, weigh approximately 400 kilograms dry. It does not have legs. It does not have wheels. It cannot walk into a forest. The position it reported that morning was 46.3, 102 north, 123.8967 west. I pulled the topo overlay immediately. The coordinates placed it in the upper drainage of the Caneta River on a steep, forested hillside 11 miles from the nearest maintained road. Dense canopy, second growth spruce, and cedar with pockets of original old growth in the ravines. No structures, no clearings larger than a deer trail. And the buoy was transmitting normally. Sea surface temperature, 11.2 degrees Celsius. Wave height, 0.4 meters. Wind speed, 6 knots northeast. It was reporting ocean conditions from the middle of a mountain forest. I want to be clear about my initial thinking. GPS modules fail. Satellite telemetry introduces latency and position errors. There's a known phenomenon called multipath reflection, where signals bounce off terrain or structures and produce false position fixes. In dense forest canopy, GPS accuracy can degrade significantly. You might see drift of 30, 40 meters, but not 47 miles. not from open ocean to inland watershed. The error magnitude alone ruled out any standard malfunction I'd ever encountered or read about. I reported it to our network coordinator, Mitchell Hale, at the consortium's operations center in Tilford. His response was what I expected. Note it, flag it for the next maintenance window, probably a firmware glitch in the GPS module. He said he'd seen similar artifacts twice before in his career, once from a buoy that had been struck by a container ship and dragged for several miles before the mooring parted, and once from a bad clock sync that put a buoy's position in the middle of Montana for about 6 hours before the firmware self-corrected. He told me to watch it. If it persisted more than 24 hours, we'd schedule an early retrieval. It persisted. For 3 days, CB439 transmitted from the same inland position. The coordinates didn't drift. They were stable to within 8 decimal places, far more stable than any GPS fix I've ever seen from a buoy at sea, where wave motion alone introduces constant positional jitter. This thing, wherever it was stationary, dead still, reporting ocean data from a forested mountainside with the positional confidence of a survey-grade ground station. On the 4th day, Mitchell authorized me to take one of our service vessels out to CB439's charted station position and perform a visual confirmation. If the buoy was still physically there, we'd know the telemetry was corrupted. If it was gone well, then we'd have a different kind of problem. I took the 26-foot rigid inflatable out of Tilford Harbor at 0530. Calm seas, light fog, visibility about 3/4 of a mile. Reached the station position by 0740. I had the coordinates loaded into the helm plotter, and I drove straight to them. The mooring was there. I could see the chain rising from the anchor weight on the sonar display, but there was no buoy. The chain terminated at the surface in a frayed end, not cut, not unshackled. Frayed, as if something had pulled the buoy away with such sustained force that the galvanized proof coil chain had fatigued and separated. I've seen mooring failures before: storm damage, vessel strikes, ice loading in the far northern stations. But those produce clean breaks at the weakest link, usually at a corroded shackle or a worn connection point. This was different. The chain looked stretched. The links near the separation point were visibly elongated, as if they'd been subjected to a slow, immense, continuous pull over a long period. I photographed everything. I pulled a 3-meter section of the frayed chain aboard for metallurgical analysis. Then I sat there in the RIB, in the fog, 11 miles from shore, and I checked my tablet. CB439 was still transmitting, still inland, still reporting sea conditions. I called Mitchell from the sat phone and told him the buoy was physically absent from its station. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear the hiss of the satellite connection. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Check the archive. Go back 90 days on that identifier." When I returned to harbor and pulled the 3-month telemetry archive for CB439, what I found made the hair on my arms stand up in a way that I can only describe as involuntary recognition, the body understanding something before the mind can articulate it. The buoy's position had not jumped. It had migrated. Over 90 days, the reported coordinates showed a slow, steady track inland. Not in a straight line, the path followed the Canetta River, upstream. From the river mouth at Canetta Bay, where the estuary opens to the Pacific, up through the tidal flats, past the old bridge pilings at Garrison, up through the narrowing valley, past the defunct salmon hatchery, through the gorge section where the river drops over a series of basalt ledges, and then up into the upper drainage where the current position sat. 47 miles of river at roughly half a mile per day. The track was smooth, continuous. There were no jumps, no gaps, no corrections. It looked like a vessel transit plotted on a chart, like something was genuinely traveling upstream and the GPS was faithfully recording its passage. But a buoy cannot travel upstream. A 950-pound steel and foam platform cannot ascend a river against the current, navigate rapids, pass over 3-meter waterfalls, and climb into a drainage where the river is barely 2 meters wide and 50 centimeters deep. It is physically impossible. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk in the small apartment above the harbor chandlery where I lived during contract season, and I went through the data point by point, every 10-minute transmission for 90 days, 8,600 data points, and as I plotted them, I noticed something else. The ocean data, the wave heights, temperatures, wind speeds, they were real. I cross-referenced them against the other buoys in our network. The sea surface temperature, CB-439 reported, matched the readings from its neighboring stations to within standard deviation. The wave heights correlated with swell patterns recorded by CB44 and CB438. The barometric pressure tracked the synoptic weather systems that moved through during that period. CB439 was transmitting genuine, accurate ocean data from 47 miles inland. Either the buoy was somehow still measuring the ocean from a forest hillside, which is insane, or something at that position was generating data that precisely replicated what the Pacific Ocean was doing in real time, 11 miles offshore, at the exact coordinates where CB439 used to be moored. I brought this to Mitchell the next morning. I expected him to escalate at contact the consortium board, maybe loop in a university research group. Instead, he closed his office door, sat down across from me, and pulled out a manila folder from his bottom desk drawer. It was unlabeled. Inside were printed telemetry logs from 2019. CB412, he said. Same thing. 5 years ago. Slow inland track up the Vashon Creek drainage, about 60 miles south of here. Took 4 months. Got about 30 miles upstream before the transmission stopped. I asked him what happened, what they found. Nothing, he said. We sent a team up the creek in a Zodiac as far as they could get, then on foot. Found nothing. No buoy, no wreckage, no sign anything had been there. The transmissions just ceased on day 118 and never resumed. We wrote it off as an extended telemetry malfunction and replaced the unit. I asked if the original buoy was ever recovered from its mooring position. He shook his head. Mooring chain was intact. Buoy was gone. Same fraying pattern you photographed yesterday. I asked him why this wasn't documented anywhere in our standard operational files, why I'd never heard of it in 9 years of contract work. He just looked at me and said, "Because nobody could explain it, Renee. And in this business, if you can't explain something, you don't submit it to the people who fund your contract. You file it somewhere quiet and hope it doesn't happen again." He let me keep the folder. I spent that evening comparing the two data sets. CB412's track had followed Vashon Creek precisely every bend, every oxbow, every tributary junction. It navigated the waterway like it knew the river, and its ocean data had also been accurate, reporting genuine Pacific conditions from deep in a coastal mountain forest. But there was one difference. CB412 had reported something that CB439 had not yet transmitted. On day 63, mixed in with the standard meteorological data, CB412 had transmitted a wave period measurement of 9,412 seconds. That's over 2.5 hours. There is no ocean wave with a period of 2.5 hours. The longest tsunami wavelengths produce periods of maybe 30 to 40 minutes. This was beyond any known oceanographic phenomenon. I checked CB439's data stream for similar anomalies, found one on day 71, a wave period of 7,886 seconds over 2 hours, buried in otherwise normal data, easy to miss if you weren't looking. These weren't errors. They were too precise, too isolated, too consistent with each other across 5 years of separation. Something was encoding information in the data fields, using the existing telemetry format as a carrier for something else entirely. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't know entirely what it means, but I began to feel a dread that had nothing to do with the impossibility of the buoy's position and everything to do with the possibility that the position was real, that something physical had traveled up that river and was now sitting in a forest on a mountainside, still connected to the ocean by some medium I couldn't perceive or measure. On day 94, 4 days after my discovery, I made a decision that I've since questioned every day. I decided to go up the Caneta and find it. I told Mitchell I was taking personal time. He didn't ask why. I think he knew. I think part of him wanted someone to go, and part of him was grateful it wasn't him. He handed me a satellite communicator, the emergency kind, the orange brick with the SOS button, and told me to check in every 6 hours. I drove to the Caneta River access point at the old forestry bridge, 12 miles up a decommissioned logging road that hadn't seen gravel in a decade. Alders had grown in from both sides, scraping my truck's mirrors. The bridge itself was closed concrete barriers and a faded county sign, but the road continued on the near bank as a walking trail used by the occasional fisherman. Beyond the bridge, the valley narrowed and the canopy closed overhead. I parked at 0600 and started walking. I had a GPS unit, the SAT communicator, a handheld VHF radio, 2 days water, food, a headlamp, and the tablet showing CB439's last reported position, now on day 91 of its inland track. According to the coordinates, it was approximately 15 miles upstream from my starting point at an elevation gain of about 700 meters. The forest was dense in a way that people who haven't walked the Pacific Northwest interior don't understand. It isn't just trees, it's layers. The canopy at 60 meters overhead blocks most direct light. Below that, a secondary layer of vine maple and dogwood. Below that, a continuous mat of sword fern, salal, and moss so thick it swallows your boots to the ankle. Everything is wet. Everything smells of decomposition and growth simultaneously. The sound as muffled bird calls come from strange directions, and the river, when you're close to it, produces a white noise that erases all sense of distance. I followed the river for 3 hours. The trail disappeared within the first mile, and after that, I was bushwhacking along the bank, sometimes waiting when the brush became impassable. The river was low for the season, maybe knee-deep in the pools, shin-deep in the runs. Clear water over round stones. I saw spawning salmon in the deeper pools, their backs breaking the surface as they held in the current. Around 0930, I noticed something. The river stones in a section of shallows were arranged. Not naturally, I've walked enough rivers to know the difference between hydraulic sorting and intentional placement. These were stacked, small towers of flat stones, 3 or 4 high, placed at regular intervals across a gravel bar. They looked like cairns, like trail markers. I counted 9 of them, spaced about 2 meters apart, forming a line across the river, perpendicular to the current. They weren't old, no algae growth, no silt accumulation, days old maybe, possibly less. I photographed them, checked my GPS, 11 miles from CB439's reported position. I kept walking. At noon, I stopped to eat and checked the telemetry feed on my tablet. CB439 had moved. For the first time in 4 days, its position had changed. It had moved 0.3 miles upstream, toward me, away from me. I checked the geometry. It had moved upstream from my position, deeper into the valley, higher into the drainage, away. But it had been stationary for 4 days. The moment I entered the river valley, it began moving again. I sat on a wet log and stared at the screen and tried to formulate a rational interpretation. Equipment malfunction that happened to coincide with my presence. Satellite drift triggered by atmospheric conditions. Confirmation bias, making me see causation where there was only coincidence. None of these explanations survived contact with the data. The position change was real, precise, and in a consistent upstream direction, just as it had traveled for 90 days before stopping. I kept walking. The river narrowed progressively through the afternoon. The valley walls steepened. I passed through a section where the forest floor was carpeted in a moss I didn't recognize, deeper green than sword fern, with a faintly iridescent quality in the filtered light. The trees here were enormous, old growth that predated European settlement of this coast. Cedar trunks 4 meters in diameter, their bark furrowed into deep channels that collected moisture and hosted entire vertical ecosystems of fern and lichen. At 1430, I found the first piece of marine equipment. It was a solar charge controller, the same model we install in our buoy data wells. A Morningstar ProStar 30, marine grade, potted in epoxy against saltwater intrusion. It was sitting in the hollow of a cedar root, approximately 3 meters above the current waterline, as if placed there deliberately. The serial number was legible. I wrote it down. When I got back to civilization, I checked that serial number against our inventory records. It belonged to CB412, the buoy that vanished up Vashon Creek in 2019, 60 miles south of here. 5 years ago, I found more components over the next mile. A corroded temperature sensor still trailing its cable. A section of buoy hull, yellow polyethylene foam, about 30 centimeters across, weathered but recognizable. A stainless steel fitting from a mooring bridle. These were arranged, 2 not scattered randomly, but placed in visible positions, in root hollows, on flat stones above the waterline, at eye height on fallen logs, like a trail. like something was leaving markers for me. I want to describe what I felt because it matters. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sensation of being anticipated, of walking into a structure that had been prepared. The forest didn't feel threatening. It felt organized. And that was worse in some ways than if it had felt hostile. At 1600, I checked the tablet again. CB439 had moved another zero point 0.4 miles upstream. The gap between us was not closing. It was maintaining distance, roughly 4 miles ahead of me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped for any extended period. I want to be clear. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a paranoid interpretation imposed on ambiguous data, but I was watching the position updates in real time. The correlation between my movement and the buoy's movement was perfect, not approximate perfect. I made camp at 1700 in a flat spot above the river on a bench of old flood deposited gravel, set up my bivvy, ate, and checked in with Mitchell via sat communicator. I told him I was fine. I didn't tell him what I was finding. I don't know why. Maybe because saying it out loud to another person would have forced me to decide whether to continue or turn back, and I wasn't ready to make that decision. That night, I heard the river differently. In 9 years of coastal work, I've developed an ear for water. I can distinguish wave periods by sound. I can tell the difference between a 4-second wind chop and a 12-second groundswell by the rhythm of the impacts on a hull. Lying in my bivvy, listening to the canetta flow past, I began to hear something in the river noise that shouldn't have been there, a periodicity, a rhythm beneath the white noise. Rivers don't have wave periods. They have continuous turbulent flow that produces broadband noise, a hiss, a roar, a constant. But what I was hearing had structure, a rise and fall, maybe 8 seconds apart, like a swell breaking on a beach, like the river was breathing with the ocean's rhythm. I unzipped the bivvy and walked to the bank, shone my headlamp across the water. The surface was moving normally downstream, turbulent, unremarkable, but the sound persisted. The oceanic pulse under the river's voice. I stood there for 10 minutes, trying to localize it. It wasn't coming from the water, I realized. It was coming from the ground. The gravel bar I was camped on was vibrating with a frequency that my body recognized as ocean swell, but my mind could not reconcile with the location. I pressed my palm flat to the stones. They were warm, not dramatically, maybe 2 or 3 degrees above ambient, but the air was 9 Celsius, and these river-washed stones should have been cold. I checked the telemetry. CB439 had stopped moving. Its position was now 3.8 miles upstream from my camp, stationary. I didn't sleep. I lay in my bivvy with my hand on the gravel, feeling the pulse, listening to the river impersonate the sea. Every hour, I checked the tablet. CB439 remained still, waiting. Dawn came at 05:45 with fog so thick I couldn't see the river, only hear it. I packed camp in 12 minutes and resumed walking upstream. Within 20 minutes, I checked the feed. CB439 was moving again, maintaining its 4-mile lead. The valley constricted further. The river was now barely wider than my arm span in places, dropping over mossy ledges, pooling in dark basins under root masses. The salmon were gone this far up. The gradient was too steep for them, but the water smelled of salt. That's not possible. This was fresh water, Snowmelt and rainwater from a coastal mountain watershed. It should smell of earth, of tannin, of decay, not salt, not brine. I knelt at the river's edge and tasted it, fresh, completely fresh, but the smell was unmistakable. Marine. The smell of a tidal flat at low water. The smell of kelp and brine-soaked sand. As I climbed, the marine indicators multiplied. I found a barnacle cluster on a riverstone dead, dried, but recent. Barnacles require saltwater immersion to survive. They do not exist in freshwater mountain streams. I found what appeared to be a fragment of kelp bull kelp, Nereocystis luetkiana, draped over a branch that overhung the stream. It was fresh, pliable, not dried out. It had been alive within hours. The forest itself was changing. Not in obvious ways, the trees were still cedar and spruce and hemlock, but their lower branches had a different quality, a heaviness. Some of them were draped in a material I initially took for moss, but which, when I looked closely, had the structure of something else. Something fibrous and translucent with a faint iridescence, like dried sea foam that had crystallized, like the residue of salt spray on vegetation near the coast. But I was 1,600 feet above sea level and 40 miles from the ocean. At 10:30, I reached a point where the river emerged from a vertical rock face, a spring, essentially. The headwater of the Caneta issuing from a fracture in black basalt. The water came out under pressure, jetting horizontally for about a meter before falling into a pool. The pool was deep, maybe 3 meters, and perfectly clear. At the bottom of the pool, sitting upright on the rock floor as if placed there, was a buoy, not CB439, not a buoy I recognized from our network. This was old, smaller than our current platforms, maybe a CB45, equivalent, a model I'd only seen in archive photographs. Red hull, not yellow, no solar panels. It would have been battery-powered only, probably from the early 2000s or before. Its identifier was visible through the clear water, stenciled in white paint on the hull. CB391, a number I'd never encountered in our current fleet, a number that should have been decommissioned before I started working for the consortium. I couldn't read the full designation from above, but the hull appeared intact. No biofouling, no corrosion visible, as if it had been deployed yesterday, not submerged in a mountain spring for God knows how long. I didn't go in. The water was too cold, and the pool was too deep, and there was something about the way the buoy sat there upright, composed, positioned exactly in the center of the pool, that made me feel that touching it would be crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. I looked at my tablet. CB439's position had stopped updating. The last transmission was time-stamped 30 minutes ago. The coordinates placed it approximately 0.2 miles from my current position, 200 meters away in this forest. Now, I looked up from the screen and turned in a slow circle. Dense timber, ferns, moss, fog still lingering in the canopy. No yellow hull visible, no stainless tower, no solar panels catching the diffused light. But I could hear it, a low electronic tone, the sound a buoy makes when its telemetry module initializes for transmission. A sound I've heard 1,000 times on maintenance visits. A rising chirp followed by a 3-second carrier tone. I know this sound the way a mechanic knows the starter motor of a specific engine. It's CB439's transmission cycle. I'd recognize it in my sleep. It was coming from uphill, above the spring, above the headwater, in a part of the forest where there is no water at all, just a steep slope of mossy deadfall climbing toward a ridge that separates the Canetta drainage from the next valley. I walked toward the sound. I walked for maybe 5 minutes. The slope was steep enough that I was pulling myself up on roots and branches. The chirp repeated, regular as a heartbeat, every 10 minutes, exactly as the telemetry cycle would dictate during active storm mode transmission. But there was no storm. The air was still. I came to a flat spot, a small bench in the terrain, maybe 4 meters across, and I stopped. The ground was wrong. It was level in a way that forest floors are never level, perfectly flat, and it was wet, not with rainwater or seep, but with standing water that was maybe 2 centimeters deep across the entire surface. This shallow pool reflected the canopy overhead like a mirror, and below the water, the ground was not soil or rock or duff. It was sand, fine, gray, marine sand, beach sand, the kind of sand you find in the swash zone of an open coast beach, quartz and feldspar and tiny fragments of shell. On this sand, in this shallow pool of still water, in the middle of a forest at 1,600 feet elevation, 47 miles from the Pacific Ocean, there were waves, tiny waves, centimeter-high ripples moving across the surface of this impossible puddle in a perfect, regular pattern, a swell, a miniature ocean swell, crossing a pool of water no larger than a parking space, on the side of a mountain in a forest that has never seen the sea. The wave period, I counted it instinctively, the way you count when you've spent years reading the ocean, was 8 seconds. The same wave period being reported by our offshore buoy network that morning. CB439's transmission chirp sounded again, directly below my feet. The buoy was here, under this impossible patch of ocean that had grown like a lesion in the mountain's skin. The telemetry was accurate. The position was correct. The ocean data was real. CB439 was reporting sea conditions because in some way I cannot explain to you in any language I possess. The sea was here. I backed away. I didn't run. My legs felt heavy, leaden, the way they feel in dreams where your body refuses speed, but I moved steadily downhill, back to the spring, past the submerged red buoy, along the river that smelled of salt, through the forest with its iridescent knot moss and its warm gravel bars and its impossible barnacles. I walked for 6 hours straight, back down the valley, and I did not stop until I reached my truck. During that walk, I checked the tablet 3 times. CB-439 was stationary. It did not follow. But its data stream had changed. The wave period field now read 14,227 seconds, nearly 4 hours. A wave whose period exceeds any physical oceanographic phenomenon by an order of magnitude, or a countdown, a duration measured in a unit that only makes sense if you know what wave periods represent. I drove to Tilford without stopping. I went directly to Mitchell's office. It was 2100 hours. He was still there. I think he'd been waiting. I told him everything. The components, the salt smell, the barnacles, the kelp, the sand pool, the waves, the sound. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out another folder thicker than the first. Inside were printed satellite images, aerial survey photos, forestry assessment maps dating back to 1987. "Look at these," he said. He spread them across his desk in chronological order. I looked. They were all of the same area, the upper Canetta drainage. In the 1987 image, the forest was unbroken canopy. In 1994, there was a small discoloration, a lighter patch, maybe 20 meters across. In 2003, it had grown to about 50 meters. In 2011, roughly 100. In the most recent image, 2023, the patch was over 200 meters in diameter. In each successive image, the patch was lighter. In the 2023 image, it was distinctly blue-gray. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "I found these about 3 years ago," Mitchell said. "After CB412, I went looking for anything anomalous in the watersheds where the buoys tracked. This was the only thing I found." "What is it?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but it's growing. It's been growing for at least 40 years. And the buoys, our buoys, are going to it, following the rivers upstream like they're migrating." He pulled out one more image, a composite overlay showing every river system on our section of coast, from Tilford to Gray's Inlet, 23 watersheds, and in each one, marked with a small blue dot placed by Mitchell himself, a similar discoloration was visible in the upper drainage, some smaller, some larger, all growing, 23 patches of ocean growing in mountain forests above every river on a 160-mile stretch of coast. I asked the only question that seemed to matter: what happens when they're big enough? Mitchell looked at me with an expression I've never seen on another human face, something between terror and exhaustion, and the strange calm of someone who has been carrying an impossible weight for too long. "I think they meet," he said. "I think they reach a size where they connect, downhill, through the watersheds, back to the ocean. And when they do, when 23 patches of Pacific that grew from nothing in mountain forests all connect simultaneously through 160 miles of river system." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I think about those anomalous wave periods, 9,412 seconds from CB412, 7,886 seconds from CB439, 14,227 seconds from my last reading. If they're countdowns, durations measured from point of transmission, they're getting longer, not shorter, which means they're not counting down to an event. They're measuring something already happening, a wave already in transit, a wave so large that its period is measured in hours, a wave that isn't water moving through ocean, but ocean moving through land, a slow geological swell passing through stone and soil and root system, carrying the Pacific uphill and inland at a rate too slow to feel, but too steady to stop. The satellite images confirm it. The patches grow at about 3 meters per year radially. At that rate, the ones in adjacent watersheds will merge within our lifetimes, within my lifetime. I still check ZB439's feed every morning. It transmits faithfully from its position in the upper Canetta, reporting sea conditions that match our offshore array with perfect accuracy. Sometime in the last month, 2 more buoys in our network went silent at their mooring positions, CB444 and CB437. Their mooring chains showed the same elongated fraying. Their telemetry has not yet reappeared, but I've started checking the river systems they're nearest to: the Vashon, the Little Kino, I've pulled the archive position data going back 6 months. CB444 is already 14 miles up the Vashon. CB437 is 9 miles up the Little Kino. They're all going home. That's what I think now. That's the only framework I can construct around what I've witnessed. These buoys aren't malfunctioning. They're migrating, following river systems upstream to patches of Pacific that are growing in the mountains, returning to the ocean that shouldn't exist yet, but does, growing in the interior, advancing through the forest floor, one grain of sand at a time, patient as geology, silent as moss. And I think the buoys always knew it was there. I think their instruments are detecting the truth that there is ocean here, that it has always been here underneath the mountains, between the rocks, woven into the water table like a thread of salt through fresh. And now it's surfacing, slowly, inevitably, in 23 places along this coast. I haven't resigned. I still service the remaining buoys. I still clean the solar panels and replace the corroded shackles and download the data and submit my reports. But I no longer trust that the ocean is only where the maps say it is. I no longer trust that coastal means what it meant. The coast is not a line, it's a negotiation, and the ocean is winning that negotiation in a direction nobody was watching. Mitchell retired 6 weeks ago. He left me the folders, all of them, every satellite image, every anomalous telemetry log, every serial number traced to a component found miles from where it should be. He also left a note, handwritten on consortium letterhead. They're not going to the ocean in the mountains. The ocean in the mountains is calling them. Check the wave periods again. They're not measurements, they're identifiers. Each patch has its own period, its own frequency, its own voice, and the buoys hear it because we built them to listen. I've since confirmed this. Every anomalous wave period I've found corresponds to a unique inland location. 9,412 seconds, the patch at the head of Vashon Creek. 7,886 seconds, the Caneta. 14,227 seconds. A third location I haven't visited yet, in the upper drainage of the Tilford River, only 8 miles from town. They're singing to our infrastructure, and our infrastructure is answering. Last week, I found a barnacle on the freshwater intake pipe at Tilford Harbor's municipal dock. One single barnacle, alive, healthy, in water that the salinity meter reads as completely fresh. I checked the tidal records. No saltwater intrusion event has been documented in Tilford Harbor for over 60 years. The barnacle is species appropriate for the open Pacific. It is growing in fresh water. It should not survive 24 hours without salt. It has been there, I can now see from the growth rings in its shell, for approximately 2 years. I don't know who to tell. I don't know what agency handles this. I don't know what discipline of science describes an ocean that grows from the inside of a continent. I don't know what happens next, but I check the telemetry every morning, and every morning more buoys are moving, upstream, inland, toward the voices in the mountains that sound exactly like the Pacific, because they are the Pacific. They have always been the Pacific. The coast is not where we drew it on the maps. It never was. That was 3 months ago. What I'm about to describe is what happened after the part I couldn't have anticipated, the part that changed what I think this is from a phenomenon into something with architecture, something with sequence, something that is not random and not natural and not waiting. In early March, I began receiving service alerts from buoys that were still at their mooring positions, not migration alerts, diagnostic flags, battery anomalies. Specifically, the charge state of several units was climbing beyond their solar input capacity. A CB950 with three 30-watt panels in winter light at this latitude should maintain between 60 and 75% state of charge. Standard. Predictable. I've tracked these numbers for 9 years, and the seasonal curves are as reliable as sunrise times. CB441 reported 94%. CB446 reported 98. CB443, the one farthest south in our array, positioned off the mouth of the Grays River, reported 106%. That's not a valid reading. Lithium iron phosphate batteries do not charge beyond their rated capacity. 100% is 100%. A reading above that means either the battery management system has failed or the sensor measuring it has lost its reference calibration. Both are maintenance triggers. I scheduled a service run to CB-443 first because of the impossible reading and because of its proximity to the Grays River watershed, one of the 23 drainages Mitchell had marked with a blue dot. I reached the buoy at 08:15 on a calm morning. March light, flat water, the kind of gray Pacific stillness that makes the horizon disappear into the sky. CB443 was sitting normally in its station position. Yellow hull, solar tower intact, navigation light flashing its correct 4-second rhythm. Externally, nothing was wrong. I tied off to the mooring bridle and climbed aboard the platform to access the data well. Standard procedure: unlock the central hatch, lift the lid, inspect the electronic stack, run diagnostics on the charge controller, check cable connections. I've done this hundreds of times. The sequence is muscle memory. When I opened the hatch, the smell hit me before I could see inside. Salt. Not the ambient salt of being at sea, a concentrated, mineral-heavy brine smell, like the inside of a tide pool that's been evaporating in summer heat. Dense, almost chemical. The data well was wet. Not leaking wet, not condensation wet. The electronics were submerged in approximately 4 centimeters of clear liquid that I initially assumed was rainwater intrusion from a failed hatch seal. But the hatch seal was intact. I'd checked it, and the liquid wasn't fresh. I touched it, tasted my finger without thinking, the same reflexive test I'd done at the Canetta. Seawater. Concentrated seawater. Saltier than the ocean surrounding the buoy, significantly saltier. The kind of salinity you'd find in an evaporation pond or a landlocked saline lake. The electronics were functioning normally, despite being partially submerged, which shouldn't be possible. The charge controller, the data logger, the telemetry module all operating, all showing green status, LEDs through the brine. These are marine-rated electronics with splash resistance, but they are not designed for submersion. The circuit boards should have shorted within minutes of contact with salt water. I scooped a sample into an empty water bottle. Then I noticed something on the underside of the hatch lid that I hadn't seen when I first opened it. A mark, etched into the aluminum, not painted, not written, but scored into the metal with something sharp, a number 7886, CB439's wave period, the Canetta's frequency. This buoy, CB443, still moored at its correct offshore position, 40 miles south of the Canetta watershed, had the Kaneta's identifier scratched into its surface hatch. I closed the well. I sat on the buoy's deck with my legs hanging over the side, and I tried to breathe evenly and think clearly. The sea around me was calm, normal, a few gulls, the distant shape of a container ship on the horizon, everything visually ordinary, everything instrumentally wrong. I checked the remaining buoy's diagnostic alerts from the deck of my RIB, scrolling through the morning's telemetry pull on my tablet. Of the 14 buoys still reporting from their correct offshore positions, 9 now showed overcharge readings. All 9 were moored near river mouths. I visited 3 more that day. All 3 had the same brine in their data wells. All 3 had numbers etched into their hatch lids, different numbers, each one corresponding, when I checked later, to the anomalous wave period associated with the nearest inland drainage. The buoys that hadn't migrated yet were being marked, tagged, assigned, each one matched to a specific upstream location, a specific patch of growing ocean in the mountains, as if a claim had been placed on them, as if they'd been told where to go, and the journey was now merely a matter of timing. I documented everything: photographs, GPS tagged notes, sample bottles labeled with date and buoy identifier. I filed none of it with the consortium. Mitchell's lesson had settled into me. This was not a problem that institutional reporting would solve. The consortium would replace the buoys, replace me, probably, and the new buoys would be claimed just the same. Instead, I started a private archive, a physical one, printed pages in a waterproof case stored in my truck, and I began mapping the timing. When did the first brine appear? When was the first mark etched? Was there a sequence? The answer to the last question: yes, there was a sequence, and it was geographic. The markings appeared from south to north. CB443 first, then 445, then 441, then 446, progressing up the coast as if something was moving along the shoreline, visiting each moored buoy in turn, preparing them. The rate was about 1 buoy every 4 to 5 days. At that rate, the entire remaining fleet would be marked within 2 months. I started visiting them ahead of the pattern. Preemptive maintenance runs to buoys that hadn't yet shown diagnostic anomalies. I'd open the hatch, check for brine, check for etched numbers, clean wells, no marks, dry, normal. And then I'd return 3 days later and find brine pooling and a fresh number scored into aluminum that I had personally inspected 72 hours prior. Whatever was doing this was doing it between my visits, in open ocean, 11 to 15 miles offshore, without leaving any other evidence on the buoy's exterior. On April 3rd, I attempted an overnight observation. I anchored the RIB 200 meters from CB440, the next buoy in the geographic sequence that hadn't yet been affected, and watched through binoculars from dusk until approximately 0200. Nothing approached, no vessel, no swimmer, no anomalous surface activity. The sea was moderate, 2-meter swell, steady westerly wind. I eventually dozed in the wheelhouse. At 0430, I motored to the buoy and opened the hatch. Brine, fresh, still beating on the interior surfaces, and a number, 11,304, etched into the lid with the same precise, deep scoring as all the others. Whatever was marking these buoys had done it while I was watching, or it had done it from below, from inside the buoy's sealed hull, in a direction I wasn't monitoring because I was looking outward at the sea surface. I thought about the spring at the head of the Caneta, the water jetting from solid rock under pressure. I thought about CB391 sitting at the bottom of that pool, the old decommissioned buoy from a generation before mine. And I thought about what Mitchell said. The ocean in the mountains is calling them. Maybe the connection wasn't one directional. Maybe it wasn't just the buoys migrating toward the inland ocean. Maybe the inland ocean was also reaching toward the buoys, through the water table, through the rock, through whatever medium carried those impossible wave periods across 40 miles of mountain and forest. The brine in the data wells wasn't intruding from outside. It was emerged from within, rising up through the buoy's hull, from somewhere below the waterline, from the anchor chain, from the mooring, from the seafloor itself. The ocean beneath the buoys was already connected to the ocean in the mountains. The migration wasn't a journey, it was a homecoming. April 14th. I received a call from the Tilford Municipal Water Authority. They were seeing unusual readings at the town's water treatment plant. Elevated mineral content in the raw intake water drawn from Tilford Creek, which flows down from the mountains east of town. Specifically, elevated sodium chloride, not at dangerous levels, not enough to affect taste or safety, but climbing. The trend line over the previous 6 weeks showed a steady, linear increase from background levels of approximately 12 parts per million to the current reading of 89 parts per million. The treatment plant superintendent, a woman named Carol Wybera, contacted our office because she knew we operated marine monitoring equipment and thought we might have data on saltwater intrusion in the nearshore zone. She was looking for an oceanographic explanation, a storm surge, an unusual tidal event, something that might have pushed salt water upstream into the creek's lower reaches. I met with her that afternoon at the treatment plant. She showed me the trend data on her monitoring system, a continuous chart recording conductivity, turbidity, and dissolved solids in the raw intake. The sodium chloride line was a smooth, ascending curve. No spikes, no fluctuations, steady as a tide that never turns. I asked her where the intake draws from. She pointed at a map on the wall. Tilford Creek, at a diversion point approximately 6 miles upstream of town, above any possible tidal influence. The creek's headwater is, and I felt the confirmation settle into me like cold water in the upper drainage east of town. One of the 23 watersheds Mitchell had marked. The wave period associated with that drainage was 14,227 seconds. The number I'd recorded from CB439 during my last reading in the Caneta on the day I found the sand pool. The frequency of the Tilford Drainage's inland ocean patch was already in CB439's transmission. They were already networked, already singing to each other through the rock. I asked Carol how long the trend had been climbing. She said she'd first noticed it 6 weeks ago, but when she pulled the older archived data, the increase had probably started about 8 months prior at a rate too slow to trigger automated alerts. 8 months, the same time frame as CB439's migration. I didn't tell her what I knew. What could I have said? That the ocean is growing in the mountains above her town, that her water supply is slowly, imperceptibly becoming the Pacific. She would have thought I was insane. And she wouldn't have been wrong to think that, because I'm not entirely certain I'm not. But I took her data, I added it to my archive, and I started monitoring the Tilford Creek watershed, myself driving up the access road every few days, checking the creek at various points, testing salinity with a handheld refractometer I borrowed from our buoy calibration kit. The salt gradient increased upstream. This is the opposite of what should happen. In any normal system, salinity decreases as you move away from the ocean. Rivers become fresher the farther upstream you go. But Tilford Creek was saltier at 12 miles above town than it was at 6, saltier at 18 miles than at 12. The salt was coming from above, from the headwater. On April 29th, I drove as far up the creek drainage as the road allowed, and then hiked another 3 miles. The refractometer readings climbed steadily. At the highest point, I reached the creek barely a meter wide. Flowing over mossy stones in dense timber, the reading was 4.2 parts per thousand. Open ocean salinity is 35 parts per thousand. This creek, at its headwater, was 12% of the way to being sea, and it was getting there at a measurable rate, climbing, every reading higher than the last. I stood in that narrow creek in the forest above Tilford, and I watched the water flow over my boots, and I tried to calculate how long, until the treatment plant's filters can't remove enough salt. How long until the tap water in town tastes of ocean? How long until the creek runs brine, and the fish die, and the riparian vegetation withers, and the forest begins to change? The satellite images Mitchell left me show the patches growing at 3 meters per year radially. But the salinity data suggests the chemical influence extends far beyond the visible boundary. The ocean is leaching downhill through groundwater, through fractures in the basalt, through root systems and soil horizons, and every permeable medium available. The patches are the visible surface of something much larger beneath. I now believe, and I know the weight of this statement, that the 23 visible patches are not separate phenomena. They are surface expressions of a single connected body, a layer of ocean existing within the mountain range itself, interstitial, occupying the spaces between rock, the way groundwater occupies an aquifer, growing, rising, approaching the surface in 23 places simultaneously. And our buoy network, designed to listen to the Pacific, is hearing it from both directions, from below their keels, where it always was, and from the east, from the mountains, where it is becoming. The buoys are caught between two surfaces of the same ocean, and they're choosing the one that's new, the one that's calling. 5 days ago, CB440 departed its mooring, chain frayed in the same elongated pattern. Telemetry reappeared 26 hours later, reporting from the mouth of Tilford Creek, already 3 miles upstream, moving at the established rate. It's heading for town. I have not filed a report. I have not contacted the consortium board. I have not spoken to Carol Wybara again, though her weekly salinity readings continue to climb, and she has begun to mention it in municipal water quality notices as seasonal mineral variation. Instead, I have done one thing. I drove to the coast, to the actual coast, the beach at Tilford Head, where the Pacific meets the land in the way we understand, the way that makes sense, waves on sand, salt spray on driftwood. I stood at the waterline at low tide. and I looked at the ocean, and I tried to feel it as the boundary it's supposed to be, but the sand under my feet felt warm, 2 degrees, maybe 3, above what the air temperature warranted for a morning in early May, and the wave period I counted it, because I always count it now, was 8 seconds. The same 8 seconds I felt in the gravel bar on the Canetta, the same 8 seconds in the impossible pool at 1,600 feet, the same 8 seconds here at sea level on the beach I've walked for 9 years. There is no boundary. There never was. The coast is not where the ocean stops. It's where the ocean lets us see it. And now it's choosing to be seen somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere we built towns and drew water and thought we understood the shape of the world. I check the telemetry every morning. 3 more buoys have begun their migrations as of yesterday. The fleet is dissolving unit by unit, drawn upstream, drawn inland, drawn toward frequencies that our instruments can measure but our minds cannot accept. In 6 months, I will have no buoys left to service. The mooring chains will hang empty in the current, frayed at their upper ends, pointing at nothing, and the rivers will taste of salt, and the forests will smell of brine, and the sand will appear in places where sand has never been, and the barnacles will grow on freshwater stones, and small waves will form in pools that have no tide, no wind, no moon to pull them. And somewhere in the mountains, 23 patches of Pacific will continue their slow radial expansion, 3 meters per year, until the day they reach each other through the watershed seams. And on that day, the wave period will finally make sense, because you'll be able to measure it from any point on what used to be dry land, and it will read the same as the open ocean, and the word coast will have lost all meaning, and someone will check the telemetry out of habit and find that every buoy in the network is reporting from the same position. Here, wherever you are. The ocean was always here. We just built our instruments sensitive enough to finally confirm it.